The classroom went the kind of quiet that has a temperature to it. Cold. The substitute stood at the front with a worn paperback held loose in one hand, and he was smiling the way a man smiles when he already knows the answer to a question he has not asked yet. He looked down the rows of desks past the children who would not meet his eyes, and he stopped on the boy in the third seat by the window, a thin boy, 14 years old. A boy in a hand-me-down sweater with one cuff fraying at the wrist. "Read it out loud," the substitute said, "the passage on the board. Let us see what you can do." The passage on the board was a paragraph of French. 8 lines of it copied in chalk from a textbook that had been sitting unopened in the supply closet for 2 years. The substitute had written it as a joke, a small private joke he expected only himself to enjoy, and he had chosen the quiet boy by the window because the quiet boy by the window had said almost nothing all morning, and silence in a child reads, to a certain kind of adult, as an invitation. The boy looked at the board. He did not look afraid. That was the first thing that did not fit. A boy who has been set up to fail in front of 30 classmates usually shows it somewhere, in the shoulders, in the hands, in the way the eyes drop. This boy only looked at the board the way you look at an old photograph you have seen 1,000 times. Then he opened his mouth, and the room changed. Hold that. Hold the boy with his mouth half open, the chalk dust still hanging in the light from the window, the substitute still smiling because he has not yet heard the sound that is about to come out. We are going to leave them there for a while. Because before you can understand what that sound did to that room, you have to understand the boy and the woman who raised him and the small apartment 3 miles away where a language nobody in that school district expected had been kept alive on purpose, like a flame somebody refused to let go out. His name was Elias Toussaint. He lived with his great-aunt in a second-floor apartment above a shuttered tailor's shop on a street where half the storefronts had brown paper taped over the glass. The aunt's name was Naomi. She was 61 years old, and she had hands that had spent 40 years pressing other people's clothing, first in a hotel laundry, and then, when her knees gave out on the standing, at a dry cleaner 6 blocks from the apartment, where she sat at a sewing machine and took in hems and let out seams and made the worn look new again. Naomi had raised Elias since he was 4. His mother, her niece, had died in a winter that Naomi did not talk about, and his father had been a name on a form, and nothing more. So it was Naomi and Elias, the two of them, in 3 small rooms that smelled of pressed cotton and the lavender water she kept in a spray bottle on the windowsill. And in those 3 small rooms they spoke French. Not the French of a classroom, the French of a family. The French Naomi's own grandmother had carried up from the islands in a cardboard suitcase, the French of lullabies and scolding and prayer, the French that had a particular music to it, soft on the vowels, that no textbook had ever managed to print. Naomi spoke it to Elias every evening over supper. She corrected him when he reached for the lazy English shortcut, the half-word, the slang. "Say it properly," she would tell him. "Say the whole thing. Language is the one inheritance nobody can come and take off you in the night. Here's what you need to understand about that apartment. It was poor in the way that gets counted in dollars and rich in the way that does not. There was a shelf above the radiator, and on that shelf there were 11 books, and 7 of them were in French, and 3 of those 7 had been read so many times that Naomi had repaired the spines with strips of cloth tape cut from the same roll she used at the dry cleaner. There was a notebook too, a green composition notebook with a soft cover, and that notebook belonged to Elias. And into it he copied, in his careful, upright hand, every word he did not yet know. He kept a column for the French, and a column for the English, and a column for the little notes he made to himself about how a thing was said, where the stress fell, which sounds the mouth had to round. That notebook went where Elias went. It was in his bag on the morning the substitute pointed at the board, sitting between a math worksheet and a flattened bag of crackers, and you should hold on to the fact of that notebook, because it is going to matter more than anyone in that classroom could have guessed. But I am getting ahead of the story. Let me take you back to the morning itself, to how the boy came to be sitting by that window with a target painted on him that he had not asked for. The regular French teacher had been out for 3 weeks, a broken ankle taken on a patch of January ice in the school parking lot, and so the district had sent a substitute, a man named Gregory Pell. Mr. Pell was 46 years old. He had a degree in history and a certificate that let him stand in front of almost any subject, and he had been substituting for 9 years, long enough to have grown a particular hardness, the hardness of a man who believes he has seen every kind of student there is and has decided in advance which ones are worth his patience. Mr. Pell had decided about Elias on the first morning. He had looked at the fraying cuff and the quiet and the worn sweater, and he had filed the boy under a heading he kept for children he expected nothing from, and once a man files you under that heading, everything you do is read through it. When Elias was quiet, Mr. Pell read it as dullness. When Elias finished his work early and sat looking out the window, Mr. Pell read it as laziness. He did not see a boy thinking. He saw a boy he had already decided about. And there was the French. Mr. Pell did not speak French. He had been assigned to cover the French class because there was no one else, and a man covering a subject he cannot teach is a man looking for a way to feel large in a room where he secretly feels small. So he had taken to using the French textbook as a prop. He would write a passage on the board and have students stumble through it, and he would correct their pronunciation by guesswork, confidently, wrongly, and the children who knew no better accepted his corrections, and the few who suspected he was wrong said nothing, because he was the adult and they were 12 and 13 and 14 years old. On the third morning he wrote the long passage, 8 lines from a chapter, near the back of the book, dense with the kind of words a beginner would choke on. He wrote it slowly, enjoying it, and when he finished he turned and surveyed the room for someone to hand it to. His eye went to Elias. "Of course it did. Read it out loud," Mr. Pell said. And then, because cruelty likes an audience, he added something he thought was clever. "Let us see if you can even sound out the first word." A few children laughed, the nervous laugh of children who are relieved it is not them. Elias did not laugh. He looked at the board, and he found the first word, and for one held breath, the whole room waited to watch him fail. Now, here is the thing about that paragraph on the board. Mr. Pell had not read it. He had copied it letter by letter from the book without understanding a syllable, the way you might copy out a word in an alphabet you do not know. He did not know that the passage was a piece of a famous poem about exile and home. He did not know that it was hard, he only knew it looked impressive and short, and that was enough for the joke he wanted to make. Elias began to read. Toe. The first word came out clean and round, the vowel placed exactly where Naomi placed it at the supper table. The second word followed, and the third, and by the end of the first line something had shifted in the air that even the children who spoke no French could feel, because this was not sounding out. This was not a boy fighting a string of foreign letters. This was reading, true reading, the words flowing one into the next with the rise and fall of a person who had heard this language sung to him before he could walk. He read the second line, he read the third. His voice was quiet, but it carried, and he did not rush, and he did not stumble, not once, not on the long words, not on the words with the silent endings that trip up everyone who learns French from a book instead of from a kitchen. The accent was not the flat schoolroom accent, it was the real thing, supple and exact, the accent of a place far from that classroom and far from that town. By the fourth line, the nervous laughter had died completely. By the sixth, 2 girls in the front row had turned all the way around in their seats to stare, and Mr. Bright, Pell, who had written those lines to humiliate a boy he had already dismissed, stood at the front of his own classroom and felt the floor tilt under him because he could not understand what he was hearing, but he could understand exactly what it meant. It meant he had been wrong. Publicly, completely, in front of 30 children, wrong. Elias finished the 8th line. He let the last word settle. Then he closed his mouth and looked. Not at Mr. Fore. Pell, but back out the window as though he had simply been asked to do a small thing and had done it and was now waiting to be told what came next. The silence after he stopped was longer than the reading had been, and in that silence A smaller, harder thing happened. The thing this whole story turns on. Because a different kind of man, caught out like that, might have laughed and said, "Well, I clearly picked the right reader." A bigger man might have said, "Where did you learn that, son? That was beautiful." Mr. Pell, in that moment, was not a big man. He was a man who had been made to feel small in front of an audience, and the smallness curdled into something meaner. He did not believe it, or rather, he refused to let the room believe it. He set down the paperback, he folded his arms, and he said in a voice pitched to be heard by everyone that he did not appreciate students making a mockery of the class. That whatever the boy had just done, gabbling and showing off, was not French, was not reading, was a performance designed to embarrass him. That a boy who could barely string 2 sentences together in English was certainly not reading a university passage in a foreign language, and everyone in the room knew it. He turned the truth upside down and handed it back to them as a lie. And because he was the adult and he said it with authority, some of the children's faces flickered with doubt. Maybe it had been a trick. Maybe the strange boy had memorized something or made up nonsense that only sounded like French. This is the move you have to watch for, not the first cruelty, the one anybody can see. The second one, the defense. The cornered man who, rather than admit the ground has shifted, plants his feet and insists the ground is where he says it is. Mr. Pell could have lost a moment of pride and gained a rare student. Instead, he chose to protect his pride by trying to make a 14-year-old boy into a liar. And he was good at it. That is what made it dangerous. He did not shout. He spoke calmly, reasonably, with the easy competence of a man who has never once been disbelieved by people younger than him. He said he would be speaking to the office about the disruption. He said the boy had a habit of seeking attention. He said, looking right at Elias, that this was exactly the kind of behavior that held the young man back. Elias said nothing. He had been taught, at that same supper table, that you do not argue with a person who has decided not to hear you. You let the truth sit in the room and you wait. So he closed his green notebook, which he had taken out at some point to follow along, and he put it in his bag. And he kept his face still, and only the very slight tremor in his hands, hidden under the desk, gave away that he was a child and that this hurt. The bell rang, the class filed out, and Mr. Pell, true to his word, walked down to the office and reported that a student had disrupted his class with a mocking performance and a defiant attitude. Now, the story leaves the classroom because the consequence of that report did not land for 2 more days, and to understand why it landed the way it did, you have to know who else was in that building. The school was Calderon Middle, a tired brick building that served the neighborhood the district had not invested in for a long time. And in a small office off the 2nd floor corridor sat a woman named Adele Caron, who carried the title of World Languages Coordinator for the district, a title that mostly meant she drove between 4 schools, keeping 4 undersupplied programs alive on a budget that shrank every year. She was the one who had hired the regular French teacher. She was the one, in fact, who actually spoke French fluently, having grown up in a bilingual home in another city far away. She was not in the building on the morning Elias read. She came on Thursdays. So when the report reached the office that a boy had disrupted the French class with a mocking performance, it went into a file, and the file would have done its quiet damage, a note in a record, a label that follows a child from grade to grade, if not for one thing. The one thing was an aide named Thérèse Boucard, a woman of 58 who had worked the front office of that school for 19 years and who, like Naomi, had grown up with French in the house. Thérèse was filing the incident report when she read the words "mocking performance," and something in them did not sit right. She had watched a lot of children come through that office. She had a sense for which reports were true and which were a grown man's wounded pride wearing the costume of a discipline matter. And she remembered Elias. She remembered him because the year before, when she had dropped a stack of forms in the hallway, he was the only child who had stopped to help her pick them up, and he had said "excuse me" to her in a way that had a small, old-fashioned courtesy in it. Thérèse did not say anything that day. She simply put a sticky note on the file, in her own handwriting, 3 words: Ask Mrs. Karen. That sticky note is the whole hinge of this story. A scrap of paper, no bigger than a playing card. Hold on to it. That evening, Ilias went home and did not tell his aunt what had happened. He set the table. He served the rice and the stewed chicken Naomi had left, warming Meta. He answered her questions about his day with the small true answers a child gives when he is protecting an adult from a worry. Fine. Math test next week. Nothing, but Naomi had pressed clothing for 40 years. And a woman who reads fabric for a living reads people too. She saw the stillness in him. She saw that he ate without tasting. And after the dishes were dried and put away, she sat down across from him at the small table under the window. And she did not ask him what was wrong. She asked him in French to read to her. She took down one of the cloth-spined books from the shelf above the radiator, and she set it in front of him, and she said, "Read me the part you like." And Elias opened the book, and he began to read. And somewhere in the second paragraph, his voice cracked, and he stopped, and he told her. He told her about the board and the passage and the way the room had gone quiet, and then he told her the part that had put the tremor in his hands, that the teacher had called it a trick, that the teacher had said it was not real, that the teacher had stood in front of everyone and turned the one thing Elias was proud of, the one thing that was truly his, into a lie and a discipline problem. Naomi listened to all of it without moving. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and put her pressing, roughened hand over his. "You read it correctly," she said. "I know you did. I taught you." "That is not a thing he can take from you," she said. "He can call it whatever he wants in his classroom. He cannot reach inside you and unmake the thing you know. You understand me? What you carry in here," she touched his chest. "No man writes that down on a form." "But there are forms," Elias said. And the forms had felt very large to him that day. "Then we will go and stand next to the forms," Naomi said. "We will not shout, we will not beg, we will simply be in the room, and we will let what is true be true where people can see it." The next morning, Naomi did something she had not done in the 3 years Elias had been at that school. She did not go to the dry cleaner. She put on the one good dress she kept for funerals and church, the navy one. She pressed herself to a knife edge, and she walked the 3 miles to Calderon Middle, and she sat down on the bench outside the main office, and she said, quietly and without heat, that she would like to speak to someone about her boy. She was made to wait. That is part of how these things work. A woman in a worn coat who speaks softly is easy to leave on a bench. She waited an hour. She did not complain. She sat with her back straight and her hands folded over her purse, and she watched the office. Slowly became aware of her, the way a room becomes aware of a stillness in the corner. It was Thérèse, the aide, who finally came out from behind the counter. Thérèse, who had put the sticky note on the file. She sat down on the bench beside Naomi, and she asked, in a low voice, "Are you here about Elias?" And then, because she had grown up in the same kind of house Naomi had, she said it in French. "Vous êtes la tante du petit Toussaint." And Naomi, who had been bracing all morning for a fight in a language built to shut her out, heard her own grandmother's language come out of a stranger's mouth in a school office, and something in her chest let go just slightly. "Oui," she said. "Shh. Shh. Suis sa tante." They talked. Therese told her carefully, because she was an aide and not supposed to take sides, that there had been a report, and that she had had a feeling about it, and that the one person who could actually settle the question of whether a child had read French correctly was the languages coordinator, Mrs. A. Caron, who came on Thursdays, which was tomorrow. "Come back tomorrow," Therese said. "Come back when she is here. And bring the boy. And," she added, looking at Naomi with 19 years of office wisdom behind her eyes, "bring whatever you have at home that shows what he can do." That was the moment the ground began to shift, though no one in that office could have felt it yet, because Mr. Pell had built his defense on a simple bet, the same bet that cruelty always makes against the poor and the quiet. He had bet that there was no one in that boy's world with the standing to challenge him. No lawyer parent, no professor, no one. The system would stop and listen to. He had looked at the fraying cuff and concluded that the boy was unprotected. He had not counted on a 61-year-old seamstress in a funeral dress. He had not counted on an office aide with a long memory. He had not counted on a green notebook. That night, Naomi and Elias sat at the small table, and she asked him to bring her the notebook. He brought it. She turned the pages slowly, the careful columns, the French and the English, and the small notes in his upright hand. 2 years of them, hundreds of pages, a record of a boy teaching himself to hold a language properly out of love and out of stubbornness and out of the simple fact that it was his. She had known he kept it. She had not known how much was in it. "We will bring this," she said, "not to argue, just to set it on the table. Let the man explain that. Now I want to slow down because the next morning is the morning everything turned, and it deserves to be told slowly." Thursday. Adele Caron arrived at Calderon Middle at 8:30 with a travel mug of coffee and a bag full of the 4 school's problems, expecting an ordinary day. By 9, she had been told there was a parent waiting, a discipline matter from the French class, and that the substitute, Mr. Pell, had asked to be present. By 9:30, she was sitting at the head of a small conference table in a windowless room off the office, with the report in front of her, trying to make sense of it. On one side of the table sat Mr. Pell. He had come prepared. He had brought his own account, written out, calm and detailed and damning, a portrait of a disruptive, attention-seeking boy who had mocked his class with gibberish and grown defiant when corrected. He spoke first, and he spoke well. He had 9 years of practice at sounding reasonable. He described the performance, the showing off, the bad attitude. He said he had nothing against the child personally. He said he was only thinking of the boy's future and the standards of the class and the example it set for the others. He was, Adele had to admit to herself, persuasive. If she had only the paper and his voice to go on, she might have believed him. But across the table sat a boy and his great-aunt. The aunt, a pressed navy dress, her back straight, her hands folded. The boy quiet, a green notebook on the table in front of him with his hand resting on it, and neither of them had said a word of defense. They had simply come and sat and waited the way Naomi had said they would. Then she did the only sensible thing, the thing Mr. Pell, in all his preparation, had somehow failed to imagine anyone would do. She decided to find out for herself. She slid a book across the table. It was a French novel. She had in her bag, a real one, nothing simple. She opened it to a page near the middle, dense paragraphs, no pictures, and she set it in front of Elias, and she said gently, in French, "Would you read me this? Just the top of the page, whenever you are ready." The room went still. Mr. Pell shifted in his chair. He had not expected a test. His written account assumed the question would be settled on paper, on his word against a child's, and he had been confident which would win. Elias looked at the page. He found the first line, and he began to read. It was the same thing that had happened in the classroom, except now there was someone in the room who could hear it for what it was. The clean vowels, the flowing connections between the words, the accent, supple and exact, the silent endings handled without a thought, the long words taken in stride. He read the top of the page, and then, because Adele did not stop him, he read on, down into the second paragraph, and his voice, which had trembled when he told his aunt the story 2 nights before, did not tremble now. It was steady. It belonged to the words. Adele Caron had spent her whole life in 2 languages. She had taught French for 15 years before she took the coordinator job, and she sat in that windowless room and listened to a 14-year-old boy from a neighborhood the district had forgotten read a passage she would have hesitated to assign to a strong 10th-grade student, and she felt something she had not felt in a long time in her job, which was wonder. "Stop," she said softly, after most of a page. Not because anything was wrong, because she had heard everything she needed to hear, and more. She asked him a question in French, an ordinary conversational question. Where did he learn to read like that? And Elias answered her in French, full sentences, easy and correct, that his aunt had taught him, that they spoke it at home, that his grandmother before that had spoken it, that it came from the islands. The whole exchange took perhaps 30 seconds, and it was the final nail because no memorized trick, no rehearsed performance survives a real conversation. You cannot fake an answer to a question you did not know was coming. Adele turned to Mr. Pell, and here is where the story keeps its promise, the promise that the figure with authority, not the boy, would be the one to name the truth out loud. "This child," she said, "reads French better than most adults I have tested for this district. His accent is native. His comprehension is complete. We just watched him hold a conversation." She let that sit. Then she looked down at the written report, the calm and damning report, and she looked back up, and she said, "So I would like you to explain to me what part of this was a mockery and what part was gibberish, and how you came to write that a child who reads like this was making a fool of your class. Now watch the man, because this is the part the niche has been building toward, and it is the part that does not let him off easy." Mr. Pell did not collapse. A weak antagonist would have collapsed. He defended himself. He said the boy must have known the passage in advance. Adele held up the novel from her own bag and reminded him she had chosen it that morning, that no one could have known. He said the boy came from a home where perhaps standards were different, and Adele's expression cooled by 10 degrees, and she asked him to be very careful about what he was implying. He said that whatever the boy could do, he had been disruptive, and that was the real issue. And it was here that Naomi, who had said nothing the entire time, finally spoke. She reached out and she opened the green notebook to the middle, and she turned it so it faced Mr. Pell, and she slid it across the table to him. 2 years of careful columns. Hundreds of words. The patient handwriting of a boy alone at a kitchen table teaching himself. "This is the disruption," she said. Her voice was quiet and even. "This is the attention he was seeking. He sought to learn his grandmother's language so well that no one could take it from him. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse. You wrote that, he mocked you. He did the opposite. He gave you the best thing he had, and you called it a lie because you could not read it yourselves." The room was silent. Mr. Pell looked at the notebook and did not turn the pages. He could not, of course. He could not read a single line of it, and everyone at that table understood, in that moment, the true shape of what had happened in that classroom 3 days before. A man who could not read the language had judged a boy who could read it beautifully, and had called the boy a fraud to hide his own ignorance, and had nearly written that judgment into the permanent record of a child's life. Adele closed the report folder. "The matter," she said, "is dismissed. There will be no note in this boy's file." She turned to Elias and she switched back into French, warm now, and she said something to him that Naomi would remember for the rest of her life. She said, "You have a gift and you have someone at home who protected it, and that is a rarer thing than the gift itself." But the story does not end at the dismissed report, because in this niche, the consequence has to be structural, not just a man embarrassed in a small room. So let me tell you what followed. The ripples, because the ripples are the point. Adele Caron did not let the matter rest at one cleared file. She was a coordinator, and she had just watched a substitute attempt to brand a gifted child a liar out of wounded pride, and she understood that a man who would do that once in front of a coordinator had certainly done smaller versions of it many times when no coordinator was watching. She filed her own report, not against the boy, about the substitute. She documented the false discipline write-up, the unqualified instruction, the pattern of a man covering a language he could not speak and correcting students wrongly with full confidence. The district reviewed it. Mr. Pell was not invited back to cover the French classes at Caldron Middle, nor at the 3 other schools on Adele's route. A man who had spent 9 years deciding in advance which children were worth his patience found that the doors he had counted on quietly closing. One by one, in front of him. He became in the end exactly what he had tried to make of others. Unseen, passed over. A name the schedulers did not reach for. That is the consequence. And it landed not because anyone shouted, but because the truth, once it was let into a room with someone who could read it, did the rest on its own. And Elias, what happened to Elias is the part I most want you to hear. Adele Caron came back the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that. She found a way, inside that shrinking budget, to enroll Elias in a regional language program, a Saturday thing, run out of a community college, an hour's bus ride away, where children with real aptitude were taught by people who actually spoke the languages they taught. She did not do the boy's work for him. She did what an ally is supposed to do, and no more. She removed the barrier. She opened the door. The walking through it, the studying, the long bus rides on Saturday mornings, the standing up in front of new and harder rooms, all of that Elias did himself, with the green notebook in his bag, in his upright, careful hand, the columns growing. 3 years later, he tested into the most advanced French placement his high school offered, and then passed it into a college-level exam he passed at 15. He kept the notebook. He kept reading to his aunt in the evenings, even when the books got harder than the ones on the shelf above the radiator. Even when he was reading her things, she had to ask him to slow down and explain. Her eyes were not as good by then. So he read, and she listened. The two of them at the small table under the window, the lavender water on the sill, the language passing back and forth between them like something handed down and handed back. Now I'm going to do the thing I told you we would do at the start. I am going to take you back into that first classroom, to the held breath, to the boy with his mouth half open and the substitute still smiling, before the sound came out. Because I want you to see it now with everything you know. You see a thin boy in a fraying sweater being set up to fail by a grown man who has decided he is nothing. That is what the room saw. That is what the substitute saw. And it was wrong in every particular. The boy was not nothing. The boy was the single most accomplished reader of that language in the entire building, more accomplished than the man at the front, more accomplished than anyone who would walk those halls all year, and the only reason no one knew it was that no one had thought to ask the right question of the right child. The competence was not created in that room. It walked in the door that morning, fully formed, carried in a worn sweater, kept alive over a stew pot in a small apartment by a woman with pressing roughened hands, who had decided years before that there was one thing in this world the landlord and the boss and the cold could never come and repossess. That is the gap this whole story lives in, not the gap between a smart boy and a foolish man. The gap between what a person is and what a careless eye decides they are. The substitute looked at a fraying cuff and read the whole boy off of it, and he was not the first person to do that to a child like Elias, and he will not be the last. The world is full of people who will glance at the cuff and never wait for the reading. So here is the small thing I will ask you to carry out of this. Somewhere near you today there is a person who is being filed under a heading the way Mr. Pell filed Elias on the first morning. Quiet, so assumed dull. Poor, so assumed unable. Plainly dressed, so assumed plain. And the heading is wrong, and the only way anyone will ever know it is wrong is if one person, just one, declines to read them off their cuff and instead waits for them to open their mouth and then actually listens to what comes out. Naomi was that person for Elias before the world ever was. She listened to him at a kitchen table for 10 years before a coordinator listened to him for 1 page. The door at the school mattered. The flame the door let into the light, though, had been kept burning at home, on purpose by a woman who knew exactly what she was protecting and exactly why. Elias is grown now. He works, the last I heard, as a translator, the bridge between people who cannot otherwise reach each other, which is the only job that boy was ever really going to do, because he had been a bridge in that apartment his whole life. Carrying his grandmother's tongue forward so it would not die with the generation that brought it up from the islands in a cardboard suitcase. He still has the green notebook. He keeps it in a drawer, the cover soft as cloth now from handling, and on the worst days, the days the old heading still tries to follow him into adult rooms, he takes it out and turns a few pages and remembers that he once read 8 lines off a chalkboard so cleanly that a man who meant to break him could not, in the end, do anything but get out of the way. If you have ever been the boy in the third seat, set up to fail by someone who decided about you before you spoke, then you already know the sound that filled that room. And if you have ever been the aunt, the one who kept the flame, who pressed the good dress and walked the 3 miles and sat on the bench for an hour and never once raised her voice, then you know the harder thing, which is that protecting a gift is its own kind of work, quiet and unpaid and almost never seen. And you did it anyway. Read it out loud. That was the dare. He did. And the only thing it ever proved was that the boy had been telling the truth about himself the whole time, in a language somebody at home had refused to let him lose. If this found you tonight and sat with you, sit with it a moment longer before you move on, and then maybe go find the quiet one near you and ask them to read you something, and wait and listen all the way to the end.